All right, in this video, we are going to kick off our discussion of the Objectivist Ethics with Chapter 7, The Good, from Leonard Peikoff's book, Objectivism, The Philosophy of Ayn Rand. Stay tuned. All right, so typically when we start off a new chapter, we give a little bit of attention to the introductory material, and then we go into the first section. We're not going to do that this time because there's quite a bit I want to say about just the topic of the objectivist ethics, and in particular from this perspective. So one thing that Onkar Ghate has stressed that I think is really valuable is the question of what for objectivism is the subject of ethics? What is the subject of morality? And part of one of the points he'll make under this umbrella is that what we get in the Objectivist Ethics, Ayn Rand's essay, but also what we get in OPAR is the final perspective, the most sophisticated, worked out perspective on the Objectivist Ethics. And one of the things that I found for myself and for others is that there's a tendency to kind of drop out of one's thinking when you're looking at this kind of final statement or final summary of the Objectivist Ethics is the richest source of Ayn Rand's moral thinking, which is her novels. And yet that is a big mistake, and you'll find it a lot harder to think about the Objectivist Ethics if you drop out the novels. And so I want to kind of bring in that richer context in a certain way, in a way that I think will be illuminating. And a lot of what I'm going to be drawing from, and I really highly recommend, are three sources. So one is the OAC lecture that Onkar Ghate has on the subject of morality. And you can find that on YouTube. You can find that on Ayn Rand University. And a lot of the ideas that I'm going to talk about now, he touches on or goes into in more depth there. Then in essays on Ayn Rand's Anthem, edited by Robert Mayhew, there's an essay by Darrell Wright, Needs of the Psyche and Ayn Rand's Early Ethical Thought, that is truly excellent. It's one of the best things that I think has been written on the Objectivist Ethics, and I think it's very undervalued. So that I highly encourage everybody to read. And then finally, in a companion to Ayn Rand, there's a chapter by Greg Salmieri on, let's find the exact title, The Act of Valuing and the Objectivity of Values. And so check out this book. I mean, this book is a treasure trove that everybody should have on their bookshelf. It is a little expensive, and so you can find a lecture version of this on Ayn Rand University as well. Greg's course, I think it's called Ayn Rand's Concept of Valuing. And so I hope everybody checks those out. Also see a lecture by, a talk by Robert Mayhew, Ayn Rand's Sacred Atheism, which touches on many of these themes, and in particular brings out something I want to at least pay heed to, which is the importance of kind of spiritual values in Ayn Rand's thinking. And I think we'll have occasion to talk about those more in future videos, but that's something I really want to emphasize, and Robert gave a very eloquent talk bringing out certain aspects of that. So with that said, let's jump in onto a few comments about Ayn Rand's moral thinking. So in Onkar's OAC class on the subject of morality, one of the issues, and really the starting point, is Onkar talks about the way in which in contemporary kind of ethical approaches, you'll often start out with certain ethical dilemmas, like the so-called trolley problems, which have been kind of wonderfully concretized in the show The Good Place. And if you haven't seen that show, check it out. It's delightful. But that Ayn Rand's view of what ethics is about is completely different. It is not about rules, and not simply for the fact that this is those are emergency situations or weird, unusual situations, but that it completely misses the point of ethics. And it effectively treats ethics as like Once every 10 years, you have to make a hard ethical decision, versus Ayn Rand's view is really that ethics is going to be a central concern of anybody's life. And one of the places in her mature work where she really draws this out and draws out why she thinks ethics is important is what is my favorite essay of any of her essays, and one of the ones that I think people have not read and studied enough, and that is Art and Moral Treason. And I just want to read a selection from that to get what I think is really a crucial takeaway of how she even thinks about why be interested in ethics. And it is not contradictory, but very different from the kind of perspective that one gets in OPAR and in the Objectivist Ethics. So she says, apart from its many other evils, conventional morality is not concerned with the formation of a child's character. It does not teach or show him what kind of man he ought to be and why. It is concerned only with imposing a set of rules upon him, concrete, arbitrary, contradictory, and more often than not, incomprehensible rules, which are mainly prohibitions and duties. Skipping a little bit. Where, then, can a child learn the concept of moral values and of a character in whose image he will shape his own soul? Where can he find the evidence, the material from which to develop a chain of normative abstractions? The major source and demonstration of moral values available to a child is romantic art, particularly romantic literature. What romantic art offers him is not moral rules, not an explicit message, but the image of a moral person, i.e., the concretized abstraction of a moral ideal. It offers a concrete, directly perceivable answer to the very abstract question which a child senses but cannot yet conceptualize. What kind of person is moral, and what kind of life does he lead? So it's what we get in this essay is romantic art holds up an image of what we can be, what we could emulate. And what morality is doing properly, what morality should be doing, is helping us translate that vision into abstract principles we can apply to our own life. So this isn't a perfect analogy, but if you can think about it this way, imagine you have the boy on the bicycle who goes and sees Rourke's buildings in the Fountainhead and is deeply inspired. And let's say he was even inspired to be an architect and thinks, yeah, this is what I want to achieve. I want to be able to build something this glorious. That's the kind of thing I want to emulate. Well, then what architecture as a science is supposed to do is give him the principles then that he can learn to do his own kind of building. So it's you see something you want to emulate, and then you need an abstract guidance on how to actually install that approach in your own life. And so this is why she thinks there's an intimate connection between art and ethics. Is you need the vision, and you always need the vision. It's not just once you translate it into an ethical code, then you can drop it away. You need to be able to, as we'll talk about when we get to art, be able to continually experience and refuel by seeing the realized vision of an ideal, and more broadly, be able to see different kinds of ideas and characters play out. But this is really what ethics is about for Ayn Rand. It's what kind of person do I want to be? What kind of character do I want to cultivate? And coming to look up to, admire, and contemplate, a Cyrano de Bergerac or a Howard Rourke or a Francisco d'Anconia or Dagny Taggart, and then using those moral principles to become what we admire and are trying to emulate. So that's really the core of what ethics is. We're trying to get principles so that we can live up to an inspiring ideal. And it's, if you think about this contrast of morality as a set of kind of rules and mostly prohibitions and don't do this and don't do that, Ayn Rand talks about it, I think, in Galt's speech about, morality is a scarecrow chasing away your pleasures. That part of her view is morality is something that should be really enjoyable and in certain respects fun, although fun is maybe too trivial a word, but it should be a really personally meaningful, valuable area of life to be thinking about, because this is how I'm going to reach that kind of vision of life that is the highest possible, and that means I can achieve the highest possible. So I made the point that we don't get the full justification or the kind of final perspective on ethics from Ayn Rand until Atlas Shrugged. In particular, as we'll talk about in the next video in some detail, is we don't get the ultimate justification for her ethics. And there's an interesting kind of question, or at least it's a question I wrestled with, which is, well, then how does one proceed thinking ethically, thinking about ethics before you have a kind of full worked out justification? Is it just kind of arbitrary and Ayn Rand just happened to like things and then, eventually realizes, oh, good, they're true? And one way to think about it is that take something like skiing or playing music, right? Like we can spot somebody who's a good skier and we can see, yeah, they make it look effortless and they're in control and graceful and able to do all these things. Or I remember I used to play guitar. I mean, I still play guitar, but it was kind of the focal point of my life as a teenager. And I remember watching a documentary about Jimi Hendrix. And what was striking was not just that he could play all kinds of, interesting things. Not that I wasn't a huge fan of his music, but his abilities were striking. But what was so amazing was how easy and pleasurable it looked to play like that. And so we can spot and we can experience ourselves as doing something good before we can yet lay out the principles of how to do it well, so that you could see, yeah, that person is skiing well. And then it would be, all right, well, what's he doing? Or if you have mastered skiing, part of then teaching is trying to break down into particular skill sets. All right, what went into this? What made this possible? And over time, you'll discover more and more about it. And maybe music is a better example, because it's let's say you master an instrument and you're able to play and write really beautiful music that is really powerful and evocative for people. And then you can say something about how you approach it and break it down into certain principles. But then ultimately you need kind of a final justification for why is this good music? And ultimately you would get, let's say, to musical theory. And I think something very similar is going on with ethics, that ethics, we can spot people living better or worse lives. And I'll talk a little bit about what Ayn Rand was looking at in terms of classifying lives as better or worse. But it's that you can see better or worse lives, and you can start to articulate certain things about them that are that characterize in what way they're going well versus lives that are going badly, in the kinds of things that one can do to make one's own life go well, and then finally reach the point of, and you can have groping justifications for it, or you could think partial justifications for it, and then ultimately lead one day to kind of a full justification and the codification of a science of ethics. And so in that sense, I think it's not surprising and not kind of a big mystery that, yeah, we can engage in ethical thinking before we have fully worked out kind of an ethical code or a foundation of an ethics. And one way to think about this is, so there's the idea of the prose principle of, oh, I was talking prose and I didn't know it. And it's, if you take the issue of thinking, which we've talked about in objectivity, it's that we said people were being rational. They were making arguments before Aristotle. They were even being logical sometimes, and sometimes being illogical. And what objectivity meant was conceptualizing what does it mean to be logical and what are ways of going wrong, of being illogical. And therefore it becomes something that's under your self-control, and you can do self-consciously in a way that's not before you get logic worked out as a method. And so I think it's the same thing with ethics, is that you can live well or you can live poorly, and you can know some reasons why and say certain reasons why I think this is the right way to act and that's not the right way to act. And what an ethical system does, if it gives you a full code and justification, is that it's like objectivity applied to life more generally, is that it's making explicit within your control, fully within your control, something that prior to having an ethical system worked out is a little bit more haphazard. It's not arbitrary. It's not that you have no reasons for why you think this was a good choice and this is a good life, but it's now fully under your control in a way that it's not prior to having a fully worked out system. I want to say a little bit about the development of Ayn Rand's moral thinking, and just a little bit, because the resources I mentioned at the beginning go into it in much more depth, and it's a lot easier to go into it in depth in writing, I think, than in speaking. And so the first thing I'll say is where Ayn Rand starts is in, you can think of it this way, a distinction between people who are living versus existing. So in her mature thought, what we get is we're going to get a distinction between living and dying, and that there are certain kind of choices that move you in the direction of living versus choices that move you in the direction of dying. But where she starts out is much more in the sense of there's people who are really living, and there's people who are just existing. They're passive versus active. And another way to think about it is that the needs, the values that she's primarily interested in at the beginning are not material values, though she's not uninterested in those, and as we'll see, has some conception of that there's a relationship between the two. But spiritual values, or the way Daryl puts it in his chapter in the book I mentioned, is needs of the psyche, that it's spiritual needs that Ayn Rand is very concerned with and predominantly concerned with. And so I just want to read some notes that she made in preparation. This is in her early 20s for a novel she planned and never wrote called The Little Street. And it gives you an idea of this distinction between living and existing that Ayn Rand saw and was taking the side of the living. And this is the conception of living that we're going to get in We the Living, Ayn Rand's first novel. So let me just quote from that. So she's talking about, she's planning this hero, and she says, he realizes that he is living. He appreciates every minute of it. He was to live every second. He is unable to exist as other men do. He doesn't take life for granted and live as he happens to be living, just calm, satisfied, normal. For him, life must be strong, high emotion. He has to live on top, breathing life, tense, exalted, active. He cannot spend 8 hours each day on work he despises and does not need. He cannot understand men spending their lives on some work and not liking that work, not doing with it what they please. He doesn't have people's attitude toward life, that is, the general way of existing calmly day to day and experiencing something strong and exalting only once in a while as an exception. Everyday life does not exist for him. His normal state is to be exalted all of the time. He wants all of life to be high, supreme, full of meaning. And then she contrasts that with her conception of what most of people are like. They do not hold anything to be very serious or profound. There is nothing that is sacred or immensely important to them. There is nothing, no idea, object, work, or person that can inspire them with a profound, intense, and all-absorbing passion that reaches to the roots of their soul. They do not know how to value or desire. They are too small and low for a loyal, profound reverence, and they disapprove of all such reverence. This idea of knowing how to value, and that valuing is an activity one engages in, and there's right and wrong ways to engage in it. This is really the central issue that Greg is grappling with in his chapter. And in Ayn Rand's Marginalia, she actually, interestingly, when she's going through Ludwig von Mises's book, Human Action, I believe it's that book, Mises was an economist, very famous economist, pro-capitalist economist, whom she respected and was friendly with. but he treats valuing as choosing something as it's better than something else or worse than something else. And Ayn Rand's view is that that's not valuing. Valuing is not saying, oh, I choose this because it must be better than the alternatives. It's a much richer activity that not everybody engages in. And I'll talk a little bit more about this, but just to give an indication, I think in her note, in her marginalia there, she put, no, it's that you have a standard that you've established and you're selecting according to a standard that says, yes, by this standard, this is good. So it's not just arbitrarily picking something going, oh, I like this better than what I see around it. It's that you've gone through a mental process of evaluation and that people cannot perform this process, and that's a real problem if they're not performing it. And in effect, another way to put this is not everybody engages in valuing, and what Ayn Rand is really concerned with is the process of valuing, and that it's that process of valuing, and I'll flesh out what that means in a minute. It's that process of valuing that explains the difference between people who are living versus just existing. So very early on, Ayn Rand knows quite a bit and writes quite a bit about what's involved in this process of value, about what are the elements of it. And here's just a quick quote from Greg's article, just so you can get a flavor of this is stuff that she had before she gets to the fountainhead. And so he's kind of summarizing a long development, but he says that early on, valuing makes a person efficacious, enables them to make serious commitments and experience profound emotions. It involves reasoning, and in particular, choosing consistent values that are both demanding and achievable in this world. It is undermined by ideologies that propound unattainable ideals, and it requires freedom. And this is one of the things that Robert Mayhew draws out in his Ayn Rand Sacred Atheism talk, the way in which Ayn Rand thought that religion and any kind of morality, any set of ideals that couldn't be practiced, goes in the category of against living and at best kind of for existing. That to value means that you're going to think, you're going to form ideals, you're going to integrate your life around these ideals, and that they're realizable. You're going to bring them into existence, and you won't settle for anything less than bringing them to existence. And that what was so obscene about religion, or one thing that was so obscene about it to her, was not like, oh, they have a really bad first cause argument. It's that it put ideals outside of the achievable, outside of human life here on earth. And that was anathema to what she thought the whole endeavor of morality was aiming to do, which was give man achievable ideals that he can long for, work for, and reach, demanding ideals, and thereby achieve the best possible here on earth. And so it's what we get here in her early work then is a lot about what valuing is, or the kind of different components of it. But in terms of what does the actual process look like, what is going on inside your mind when you value, this is going to come later. And so one component that happens early on, I didn't mention, but I just want to mention instead, she also gets that it's selfish, that to say that your ideals are realizable here in this earth, it's in your life, that what is valuable to a person, what's sacred to them, is their life. And we get a lot of this in We the Living. In fact, there's a whole discussion about Kira, the main character, says that she has what she, I think, calls an upside down question about, do you believe in God? And then if people say yes, she goes, she knows they don't believe in life. And again, it's from the perspective of they're putting their ideals outside of what the individual can achieve. And part of saying that it's a focus on what the individual can achieve, and it's about your values that you're bringing into existence and you're achieving in your life, is that it's a profoundly selfish attitude towards values. It's the things that are personally valuable to me in my life, my sacred life, that I only get one of. And so the issue of selfishness is there from the start, and it's there because it's to really value something means to value my life and the things that are going to constitute my life. What we get in the Fountainhead is that we get more of the mechanics of valuing, and we get it both and primarily in terms of how Rourke approaches his work. So he has this idea that a building has a central idea, and everything else about the building is determined in light of that idea. That a building is an integration, and he gives kind of an analogy at one point to the human body, and that what makes it beautiful is that it doesn't have a bunch of like extraneous ostrich feathers and things like that. It's that everything serves the purpose of the body. And it's the same with the building. You have a central idea that everything is integrated around. And so there's, and part of how you form that central idea is by taking into context the needs that the building is to serve and the resources available to serve it. So the building materials and the building site and things like that. And so we get, though, that same kind of integrity applies to life more generally, is that one's life needs a central idea, a central theme, or a central purpose, which for Rourke and for human beings, Ayn Rand thinks, is your career. It's the creative work that is going to be the center of your life. And everything else, including human relationships or so on, are integrated towards that and are valuable in light of that. So we get this idea of a central goal or a central purpose that then serves as a standard of selection of all other goals, all other purposes. And then in Atlas Shrugged, we get, and again, I'm not going into all of the elements here, but I just want to highlight some. What we get is that the kind of foundational distinction between those who perform this valuing process and those who don't, the basic choice involved is the choice to think or not. And that some people don't engage in this, that the people who don't value, the root of it is they don't think. They choose to, that they exist in a state of drift and evasion. And that ultimately Ayn Rand's final perspective is that they don't want to live, that they're choosing not to live. And this is kind of embodied in the characters of James Taggart and Lillian Reardon, particularly Taggart. And that living versus existing, it's really living versus dying. And to the people who don't choose to think, the people who choose to drift and evade, and they are in a real sense not choosing existing versus living, they're choosing death versus living. And that's going to be Ayn Rand's final perspective, which is that ethics is ultimately about and rooted in biological survival versus biological death. But it's not that she's overturning that perspective of living versus existing. It's that what existing really means is moving towards a worse and more, a more and more impaired state of living, i.e. closer and closer towards death. And that what living means, in her terms, is moving into a more and more appropriate state for living. It's a stronger and stronger ability to cope with the challenges of life, and that you can head in a pro-life or a pro-death decision. So it's not you make a single bad choice and you die. That's not her perspective. But if we think in terms of proper functioning or effective or efficacious functioning, it's that we can be moving in a direction that we're better able to cope with the challenges of life, or that we're more impaired, more deficient, and ultimately that the cashing out of that is literal biological death. All right, so that's what I want everybody to be able to carry into our discussion of the objectivist ethics, is that Ayn Rand is really focused on a very rich conception of what it means to live, and is deeply concerned with spiritual values. And one way to put it is a lot of her focus, if you think of We the Living and the Fountainhead, for example, are some of her most tragic characters are people who, in effect, commit spiritual suicide or undergo a spiritual death. So if you think about Leo in We the Living, and in fact, let me plug Robert Mayhew's essays on Ayn Rand's We the Living, second edition, where Onkar Ghate goes into depth on Leo's the issue of spiritual suicide. And then if you think about the fountainhead, Gale Winan, who's one of my favorite characters in Ayn Rand's fiction, it's that he's still alive by the end of it, but he's undergone a spiritual death. And these are the kinds of issues that she's deeply concerned with. And those are going to get carried in to the objectivist ethics proper. And in particularly when we get to art and a discussion of the role of art in life, Ayn Rand's preserving that perspective that we need, and that the foundation of our biological survival is our spiritual survival. It's the survival of our mind and our valuing, and our mind is not just our thinking faculty, not just our productive faculty, but it is our valuing faculty. And so another way to put it, and maybe a kind of more the way that I like to hold it, is that, we're going to talk a lot about kind of the foundations of ethics, moral principles, and so on. But at the end of the day, that what you want to be as a valuer, a person who cares passionately about things, about their life, and about everything that contributes to their life. And that all of the kind of principles that say this is how you live, these are not scarecrows chasing away your pleasures. This is, how do I preserve or cultivate in myself that passionate reverence for my life and for the things I care about and that are going to contribute to my life, whether it's my work, my love, my romantic love, my children, my hobbies, my favorite books, the ideas that I would live for and die for if necessary. All of ethics is really, at the end of the day, about how to make yourself into a person who loves their life and really loves it, and has a life worth loving and a self worth loving. And so it is the opposite of an academic topic. And though OPAR is written consciously and purposely as almost a textbook on Ayn Rand's philosophy, I think it behooves us to remember what it is these guidelines are trying to achieve. And that is the kind of material we've been talking about, and the material that is found in Ayn Rand's novels. So with that, that's the end of this video. Be sure to like the video, subscribe to the YouTube channel, hit that bell so you don't miss a single episode. And as always, the best way to stay in contact is to go to donswriting.com and sign up for the newsletter. Talk next time.